Hello, everyone. Today, I'm grateful to have Jordan Hall as a third-time returning guest here today on the Yours Truly podcast. Through the strange way that the internet and its algorithms work, with tagging, commentary, greater and lesser forms of narcissistic drawl that we all contend with, Jordan and I came into contact when he commented on an early YouTube video response I made about his Christian conversion in the early part of this year. We subsequently met a month or so later at Jonathan Peugeot's Symbolic World Summit. Coming into contact with Jordan's far-reaching mind, which is able to play and contemplate in the furthest future points of conceptual reality, is intense. However, he has the ability to practice deep presence with those he communes with in conversation. It is a true privilege and joy to have the opportunity to meet him there. I invited Jordan back today to keep building upon our relationship, to discuss the many wild things that have been manifesting into reality, many that Jordan foresaw years ago related to institutional and cultural change and collapse. I also want to hear about his experience living in the wake of the catastrophic destruction in his new hometown caused by Hurricane Helene, down in the special community of Black Mountain, North Carolina, in the western part of the state, just outside of Asheville. I equally wanted to get his take on the recent presidential election, as well as pick up on some Easter eggs he's laid out in other recent conversations here online. Let's not belabor this intro any longer. Join me today as Jordan and I practice some conversation craft here today on the Yours Truly podcast. And as always, give the video a like if you like it. Follow along on this Yours Truly journey, hit subscribe. And if you would like to support the channel financially, consider becoming a channel member. So clock in, start some chores, sit down with the baby, all in our newfound time together here today on the Yours Truly podcast. So without further delay, I give you Jordan Hall. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. Jordan, as I was mentioning, you've joined me in the headphones, and you said somebody got annoyed with your sound so bad that you had to. So they sent you the gear and said, "Start doing this."
Yes, exactly. And I finally capitulated to having, you can't see it, which is really quite nice, to having a microphone right in front of me.
Yeah.
What I did is I plugged the headphones into the microphone, as I'm sure you're very familiar with, and listened to what it sounded like, and noticed that even 3 or 4 inches did make a big difference. So I was like, all right, fine, fair enough.
Yeah.
It's been like a decade. I might as well finally get up to something like mediocre.
It's fun, man. Well, thanks for coming back today. Yeah, so I guess the first thing I actually wanted to ask you about was recently, I think you just got back from hanging out with John Heers and Jonathan Peugeot, doing with First Things Foundation, like the Art of Automata, dinners with John. I was wanting to know how'd that go. I was contemplating trying to attend that. It didn't work out. I was kind of in between some transition, but I was curious how it went.
All right, so there's 2.5 ways to answer that question. So one way is a little rough. There's more alcohol than I'm used to be perfectly frank. And the second dinner, so we had 2 dinners, 2 Automata dinners, and the second dinner, from my point of view, got a little out of control. I think Peugeot agreed. And particularly in my exact personal experience, it got a lot out of control. They have one of the protocols is how do you explain it right? Well, just visually, 2 people are honored, and they hold a vessel, usually a horn. In this case, it was actually like a clay, I'm not quite sure how you would describe it, vessel that you'd normally pour wine in and kind of go arm in arm and like drink it together, and orienting towards drain the vessel.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, they didn't put wine in it. They put in, it's called cha-cha, which is basically kind of like moonshine.
Woo.
So I drank 6 ounces of moonshine in a single glass, and had a very bad night for the rest of the, 30 minutes later, and a bad day for the rest of the next day. So I haven't had a hangover in a very long time for reasons of choice. Like, I don't like hangovers. So that was that. Stepping down a bit, it was really beautiful, oddly enough, the next day in the sort of pain of the hangover, to actually just be able to sit down and spend time with Jonathan. That was the only point during the period of time during that weekend where we just sat and talked for several hours before his family left. I got to meet his two of his two daughters. I think he only has two daughters, and then his wife, and it was beautiful. I should, for anybody out there, Family Paggio is incredible. So in terms of by their fruits you shall know them, the fruits are manifest and powerful, compelling. It's really amazing. His children and wife are lovely, and he's great. Like in person, it's just amazing how much he is. I mean, he's brilliant and precise and real time and just alive. And I'm just really glad that his moment is just continuing to unfold, because I think he's holding a tremendous amount of gift for the world.
Yes, definitely. And I was curious. Well,
Hold on,
as far as
let me do number 3 real quick, because I feel like I need to get the third.
Okay, hit 3.
Because the third is that then the actual practice of tamada, which we experience, and it unfolded. It's continued to unfold. I think that the proper way of understanding it, although it is embodied in the practice of meal, which is great, right? Because meal is, if you think about like the breaking bread, separated historically into the more pure, simple, clear Eucharist, and into the more convivial community aspect of dinner. And for the West, only the Eucharist remained, but in certain parts of the East, specifically in this case Georgia, the liturgical meal maintained. But my experience of it is that it's a version of something that is more general, which is how do we live liturgically? How do we learn how to be like practically? Like how do we learn to practically be in communion at all times, in all contexts? And so, as far as that goes, I've noticed that I've been referencing it a lot since then, both actual experiences and also a lot of things that I think that I learned in that context. So, good.
That was what I was curious about, was that liturgy in and of itself. And it is formalized, but it represents, fractally or symbolically, I think what you're talking about within the liturgy of life. And I was listening to you talk. It was like at this tech convention, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. I don't remember. It was like Vitali. It was like based off maybe
Vitalia.
Yeah. And you ended talking about liturgy and being this new idea related to the deeper parts of what it means to build a society around trust. And I think that, well, I mean, that's just a huge struggle, and it's one that I'm in the middle of contending with in my reality, where I'm at. And we've talked briefly around kind of that, you're involved in this kind of new church as well, and that's been something that I've been a part of myself. And the big question that keeps coming up for me, and the whole reason that this community even began, was a breach of trust. And that, and this can take us, I mean, into this, there's a lot of things I want to try to get to in conversation with you today, but one is this idea of trust and, trust apocalypse, I got on, I'm following the Easter eggs, and, and so, but that's been so real for me. It was real for me as an individual when I decided to trust God with my future, with my inheritance, with everything. But then when, and then have to rebuild trust in relationships in my life, with myself, with my marriage, with God, with community, that it's just so real. It's not conceptual. It's the very thing that I've lived over the last 8 years. And so I hear you talking about these new societies, all the way from Civium, all the way down to Black Mountain, all the way to relationships and trust. But that this is something that I think is, well, it's also part of why I think I felt so much resonance with you when you were making this move to Black Mountain and hearing about your Christian conversion. But I think it really, and I even, we did a conversation, I don't know if you recall, but we talked about like Bitcoin and just these things about trust trustless and trust and it being built in so that we can focus more on human trust, where these institutions, the trust in these institutions are going away quickly, but that we're able then to maybe focus on trust at the human scale. And I don't know, that's where that and how that happens in liturgy, how that happens in relationships.
Nice.
There's lots of different pieces there, but I'm in the middle of that. And I join you there. And I'm curious, like, I think in this other piece of what's going on in your life with Hurricane Helene in Black Mountain, how have these things collided for you, like conceptually into life?
That's a lot, dude. Okay, let's see. The word collided was nice because you actually took a bunch of things and you invoked a few that many people maybe, if they're not following the Easter eggs, didn't understand, but I certainly did. And then you said, okay, let's collide them. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to actually perceive everything you just said as a unity. Okay, so the reality is let's say, for example, let's just start with the trust apocalypse. So the reality is that trust is upstream of truth, right? So we cannot work together to discern what is true if we cannot work together, right? We do not trust each other. And if you just want to take a look at like what's going on in politics, everybody's speaking past each other now. Team Blue does not speak to Team Red. They speak to each other. Team Red does not speak to Team Blue. They speak to each other because they don't trust each other. And therefore, they are not communicating with each other, which means, therefore, the field of communication, the field of possible consilience on what is true is now smaller. And by the way, more biased, meaning less perceptive surface area. Okay, but what is upstream of trust? And upstream of trust, which I learned both at the Art of Automata dinner and in the context of Hurricane Helene, is some really interesting complex of intimacy, vulnerability, and communion. Or I maybe say communion is upstream of trust, but elements of communion include intimacy and vulnerability. And so, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why alcohol is present, is that alcohol has a dissolving characteristic that kind of moves out of our ordinary and moves us into a slightly more willing to be intimate and willing to be vulnerable space. That's, I think, why it's there. In the case of hurricane, trauma and crisis really have that effect, right? The way I described it is that we found ourselves on day 3, by the way. So it took 3 days. On day 1 of the hurricane, we were in this weird sort of, things are different and yucky, but we're probably still where we were. Let's say, by hypothesis, the power's out, the water's not here, but it'll probably all be back on tomorrow. So we're just kind of keep going, forward the direction we've been going. Maybe that's what putting it, the engine's cut out, but we still have momentum. But by day 3, the engine is still out. We no longer have momentum, and it is dawning on everybody that we're either going to have to row this boat or things are going to start getting really bad really fast. So everybody starts pulling out, well, not everybody, but many people start pulling out oars and start trying to figure out, how do we row together? Like, what does that look like? And that's real vulnerability. I mean, it's like real vulnerability, real concern that, hey, our food is actually going to run out. We can't communicate with anybody. The internet is out completely. We can't drive anywhere because no gas stations are running and all the roads are closed anyhow. So you're stuck, and you are actually at a place where your food is running out and will definitely be gone because you have got no refrigeration in a couple of days. And your water, by the way, there's no running water, and all the water that's around you is extremely toxic. So that's actually a real situation. That's not trivial. And there's a lot of strangers who have ended up gathering in the area because our town happens to be close to one of the roads, the big major highways that got washed out. So people will be driving towards that, get turned around, and basically just stop in our town. So there's threat, or at least strangers, right? The estranged. So what do you do? And so this is vulnerability, and the answer might be withdraw, or the answer might be step in. And when you step into a place of intimacy because you have to be ready, willing, and able to express that you have a need. And you also have to be ready, willing, and able to enter into somebody else's life adequately to help. And this is not at all trivial. In this particular mountains, even less so, because there's a prideful people. The people of the mountains are prideful in both positive and negative ways. In particular, they don't want to take. If somebody else is worse off than they are, they would rather you give to the person who's worse off than they are. Even if that's just an abstraction, even if it's like, yeah, there's a tree just smashed both my cars and my house, but their house got washed away. So go deal with them. Okay, so how do you actually enter into a real relationship, not a social relationship, not a formal relationship? There's a reason why FEMA actually can't tell. It's actually a structural problem. It's not an intent problem. It's a structural problem. And as you begin to enter into that, and you enter back into reality, which is say real, honest human relationships in the context of stake, where things really matter, then trust begins to just naturally form. Trust is a derivative. Once you're in the proper location upstream, trust forms. And then, by the way, interestingly enough, truth forms. Notice we're in actually an odd spot, because what the hell's going on? Like, which roads can you navigate? How do you get out of here? Can you get out of here? Is there gas? Like, these are real questions. When's food coming? Like, this is real questions. So truth formation is meaningful, but it's meaningful. Like, it's grounded in a proper hierarchy of values. And we can actually get whatever answers you can get on the basis of the fact that now nobody's lying. People might be disseminating rumors, but they'll actually say, look, the best I've heard, and this is a rumor, is that X. You're like, okay, that's what I got. And then you move somewhere else and somebody asks you, and you're like, okay, I've got these 3 pieces of information that I think are right. And you begin to see that's the journalistic function, right? We're cultivating a journalistic function in real time on the basis of trust, on the basis of coming into relationship, into communion. And the same thing happens, by the way, in Tamada. Is more formal, right? You don't actually have, you're all going to eat. Food is present. Water and wine are present in abundance. So the process has to work a little harder to strip you away from society, or from formality, or from persona, and restore you back into humanity, right? Into reality, and into being able to be in intimate, vulnerable relationship. But the calling, the liturgical aspect, which presences the divine, the intent is to move everybody towards the vertical, right? Move up, away from where we are now, but into the eternal, and then allow the eternal to descend back down to reorient what's happening now in a proper context. Or, if you'd like, very easily, to use the eternal to convert the chronological into kairos. And it works. It's not trivial. It takes a little while, but once it happens, you begin to notice that. And then when that happens, it stirs up in the body, and it stirs up in the soul. The soul begins to be able to speak itself through the body, and you begin actually expressing more and more things that are connected with and guided by the eternal. And then this awakens in other people, and you begin to notice that there's a presencing together.
Did your experience with Helene, you were in one of the worst spots, and these abstractions of community and deep trust and new societies came into just like crystal clear reality, I would assume, in that kind of context. Do you, and then you take this trip to the beach, and there's this kind of nice, like, what was there a little bit of like, okay, these are fractals of having to like accept, or was it an easy transition kind of going between?
Oh, well, I'll give you an even better example. As it turns out, I was supposed to be in Washington, D.C. at the Rescue the Republic gathering.
Yeah, I heard you tell Paul that.
Yeah, when the hurricane hit. So I didn't do that. But I was also scheduled to be in New York City, like on week 3. We counted everything like it's like a newborn baby. When the hurricane hit, we began to count things in days and eventually in weeks. And so now we're like, 6 weeks out. And so as I say, whatever, we're beginning to move far enough away that we're kind of back in Kronos again, more or less. So on week 3, I had a scheduled trip to New York City. In fact, not just New York City, but actually at a penthouse in the Upper West Side on like West 72nd Street. very fancy. And so in the morning, I'm, mucking out houses. I'm actually dressed in exactly the outfit I'm wearing today. I just realized. And with less mud now, I washed everything when we got water back. But since we didn't have water, I had dirty clothes, got in the airplane, flew to New York, got in an Uber. Now I'm in New York City. I'm not in Western North Carolina. And it was wild because we had received enough information that the airport was, airplanes were flying and that we could get gas. I said, my wife could drive me to the airport. So I get to the airport and power's on. That was power's on. The internet, I can get access to the internet. Wow, this is wild. Fly up to New York. There's a cab. I didn't take an Uber, took a cab, driving to Manhattan. It's Manhattan, right? They don't know that as far as they're concerned, nothing happened. And then I enter into the field of the penthouse, and there's just this experience, and it's announced that I had just come up from WNC. I wouldn't, blah, blah, blah. And there's like I hope everybody's okay, but it's in the classic kind of social graces. But I wasn't in society anymore. I was in reality. So I couldn't answer in the social way. I had to just say, well, no, in fact, I don't think anybody's okay. And there's a whole lot of people who are extremely, really not okay. And it may be that way for a long time. And by the way, it will be that way for a while. Like we got years of stuff, and people it's going to be rough for a lot of people still.
Do you feel like, yeah, I've had kind of outer body. I don't know if that's what's outer body, but something like these different realities clashing in those moments is so stark. I've felt that before. Having like doing a career change, and I was having lunch with the people I used to work with, and then I was going back into this school that afternoon, and I was like, I don't belong here. Like this doesn't feel in sync, or you said in Chronos in a certain way, and those things are interesting. I was wondering, I remember in an earlier conversation you'd said about you were walking around, Black Mountain, and you look up at this 80-year-old guy on his porch, and you're like, does it get any?
Shoe.
Yeah, well,
when's the other shoe going to drop? Yeah.
And so this shoe dropped.
That was a totally different kind of thing, man. It wasn't because the other shoe was, hey, this is all fake. Like this isn't real.
Right. Yeah.
Turns out it's more real than I thought. Like it's real.
Yeah.
So the shoe turned into, I don't know, a bird or something and flew away. It made me go, whoa, hold on. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I think both Chesterton and Lewis make the point, and I now have experienced, that reality is intrinsically miraculous. The reason why we don't experience that is we don't live in reality. We live in fact, the simulation. We actually live in a simulation. And when you escape the simulation back into reality, one of the things that you begin to notice is that reality is intrinsically miraculous. Yes. So the other shoe turning into a bird and flying away is not a bad metaphor. And I mean that in all kinds of ways, meaning we all collectively began to notice that a bunch of the synchronicities just became a very common, even an ordinary way of navigating life. That the person that you needed, and you don't have a phone, remember, you can't call them. The person you need will just kind of they'll just show up more or less when you need them. Oftentimes with what you needed without you asking, like that kind of thing. You just begin to flow with that. Like, this is interesting. It's a different way of noticing how life works. And it does work. It works quite nicely, actually. It's intense. It's exhausting. You sleep like a rock, right? Because you got candles at night too. So there's no like blue light or electricity or distractions, no internet for weeks. And so everything begins to become very grounded. We got to one meal a day because food was, we didn't have scarcity of food and you couldn't wash the dishes. So you didn't want to do that. So we just kind of had family dinner, everybody kind of eating together. A rapid restoration back to a very different mode of life. Eventually cars started coming back online, but you didn't know where to drive besides, because the roads were still pretty rough. So within about a 7-8 minute drive. And yeah, it was that notion of being present, like presence becomes much more palpable. And even noticing that it was, how do I say it right? Like, from my point of view, easier to be in a prayerful state more continuously.
Do you feel like this? I was curious like, is this going to drive Jordan away from this, or did it drive you like just deeper into that?
Well, in point of fact, we actually had a very nice decision, because when our neighbors, they had been out of town, they show up like, oh, how'd you get back? And they said, well, we found this route. So they came in, and because they wanted to be with their family. And what that meant was there was also a way out. And over time, every day, more and more roads would open up. And so less and less it was that you had to be there, and more that you chose to be there. So there's a period of like 3 or 4 days where my wife and I are talking about, do we leave? Like, should we stay? This is uncomfortable. And maybe still a little bit dangerous. Should we stay? And at a certain point, the answer was, I ain't leaving. We're just staying. So we stayed all the way through. I can imagine circumstances where we would leave. Obviously, there's just circumstances where we just become inhospitable. But many circumstances that would be rough, I would even more like stay more, like stay deeper, rather than, it's not a question of leaving, but rather this is where you go deeper. So yes, it definitely did not have the effect of, oh boy, I wish I hadn't chosen this place after all this time, but rather, what an incredible gift to have been been present for this moment, and have been here long enough that I was actually part of the community and part of a church where the church was called potently. Like, I don't know if I've said this publicly. I don't think I've said anything publicly, but like our little church of 150 people, and it was probably 50 people for the first couple of weeks because a lot of folks couldn't get out of their houses. But once people came back, and some people had left, we probably had like 1,500, 2,000 people like coming through the church to be engaging in the effort for 2.5 weeks solid. Like, there was activity. This place there was a level of commitment, and our days became very simple. You'd wake up, I'd go get toilet water out of a pool, go get fresh water, get in the car, go to the church. My wife goes into what she's doing. I pick up whatever I'm doing that day. My daughter joins the increasingly large pack of feral kids. And there's not many cars driving around, so it's like a teleportation back into the 50s, 60s, or 70s, maybe even earlier. Nobody's bathed in days. And it's just super real. Like, it's beautiful.
So it was a gift.
Yeah. I mean, that's how gifts work. I think there's a lot of sadness, a lot of tragedy, a lot of really, and even still, like, even now when you drive through the area, I just want to know it's horrible. Like, it still is horrible. Not as horrible as it was 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, but still horrible. And yet it was a profound gift. And I think it's going to continue. I think that I was just actually having a conversation today with a bunch of folks that were initially gathered around working together, connecting different groups in the relief effort. But they've continued, this portion has continued to stay gathered around this is going to be a long-term relief effort. How do we rebuild? And the sense is that there's both a possibility and a necessity that what's going to come will be tremendously beautiful.
What about the intersection between, I was going to say between technology and, the lack thereof that you experienced. And I listened to you on an X Spaces that I think Brett Weinstein was hosting. And you talked about, and there was a lot of credit being given to Starlink.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about living in the simulation. We talk like even how we meet and this digital interface. Was there a clearer or more defined aspect of, okay, because it's easy to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on the tech or on, let's just go back to, all these things. But I heard you say, like, somebody's life was saved through being able to have communication through
Totally
Wi-Fi, in the most inhospitable places. Like, did that give further clearance to you on like the relationship that we're having with technology versus, where we exist now? Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, totally. So I feel like maybe 3 different ways, like 3 different tones. One is it's important to recognize that we live in a world that is premised on cars and telecommunications. Because when you eliminate those, you begin to realize two things. One, the world gets very small. Like when you can actually only say ride a bike, you begin to realize how big that circle is and how little of the sustenance of life is contained within that circle. Close to zero. Like we got no food. We've got no water. We've got no, we're not going to make it. Like there's just no way you make it if you're limited to the distance of oral communication in a bike. Not a chance. We're very far from that world. So that's critical to actually just really, really know that's the case. And it's different than theory. Theory and practice are not vaguely the same. Okay, second. So having access to the ability to communicate was actually more important than the ability to transport, to move. Although both are really critical. But what I noticed was the proper placement, because particularly in the beginning, Starlink was extremely scarce. Like we had one at our church. There was one in downtown. Like there's not like 50 or 3, or there were 2. There are probably more in the air. I mean, I know there were more there. There was one at the Black Mountain Home for Children. There's, whatever. There was maybe 40 across an area the size of Rhode Island. Like it was relatively small. So what that means is that this telecommunications is available, but it has to be reduced to purpose. Right? It's not just, hey, I'll go browse Twitter. Like that's not what's happening. What's happening is I will communicate with people who I need to communicate with, and then I will leave the area where communication like that is possible, and I will go do real stuff, right? And in particular, by the way, it's not in my house. So when I'm home, I'm in a context where that kind of thing is physically impossible. And that was just actually, frankly, a lot better. I'm stuck. I know that's true, and yet when I go to bed, I put on Twitter. Whatever, man. I'm a deeply addicted and not in a context where recovery is likely. I'm deeply addicted and I own a bar. So, but these are all useful. And the same thing happened with cars, by the way. A car was super useful to get from my house to church. But once it was at church, I kind of didn't go anywhere in my car. I just left it there. Sometimes I would get in somebody else's truck, important truck, not car, when we're going to places where trucks are needed, but we'd all just pile in and go. Like it's functional again, right? It's transport. It's not just, maybe I'll go over here to go to a restaurant. Like it's not like as part of the pattern of life. It's more the pattern of life is grounded in proximity. The center of life, the thing that's happening in livingness, is within speaking, walking distance. But you have this capacity. So you remember the Civium story of this connection between the life and the virtual, the physical and the virtual. It was very much like that. That when Starlink was there, like when it was reconnected, like, okay, this part right here, the purely physical, the village scale by itself ain't gonna work. This right here, which is kind of how everybody lives now, with like a tiny little, the infinitesimal element of life connected to the virtual is obviously suicide. But these work pretty well. This was actually really quite effective.
Did that give you a lot of hope? Or like,
yeah, hope, and I think in the biblical sense, meaning embodied, not aspirational, but actually like, okay, I see how this can work.
Can you the difference between hope there? What are you saying the difference between like hope is there?
Well, we can maybe, hope and faith, right? I think we've talked about that. Mm-hmm. So there's a version of hope, which is basically my imaginal projections about possibilities that I think I would feel good about.
Mm-hmm. Aspirational.
And then there's experiences that I've had in my life that allow me to really be able to perceive what that would really be like and that it's possible.
Yeah. I was wondering and this can kind of take us in the direction of kind of the current happenings. Well, actually, let's stay on this for a second. I had a few thoughts. When you were talking about like the scale, I worked a lot of church camps in my life. I did a decade's worth of summers doing church camp into my young adulthood. I used to do the music for them. I was on staff. Mm-hmm. And you're at a college campus, most of these places. Some of them were, I was out in the Sierra Nevadas for summer. I was down in Panama City Beach for summer, but one of them was like in middle of Nashville. I mean, different places, but you would kind of like enter into this scale, mm-hmm. Of anywhere from like, 300 to 700 people. And, it was like a village, and there were these you're divided into teams and you compete and you come together and you worship and you go out and you study together and all these things. And there's always this like, what is this experience? I'm meeting God here. And I don't want to like totally like deny that at all. But I think there's also something deeply human that we're experiencing in that kind of just like you're talking about, and like when things are put into a type of order, even if only for a week. But if I was on staff, I was doing this for like 8 or 10 weeks a summer, like and even the part where you mentioned like the cars, because like the way a college campus in a lot of ways in these smaller liberal arts places we were at, the parking's all on like the outside, and then everything has to kind of like go into the middle, and you kind of don't need your cars very much. And I don't know there, and it is so otherworldly. It doesn't feel like how we exist in these spaces. It's like, oh, I've got a camp high. I'm high from this experience. Is what the words people use. Like, but it's almost like we would be like that. People existed in that higher state probably more often in different times and spaces in a certain way. And we have to, take a break from the simulation to breathe that air or something. And things like hurricanes and disasters, things like 9/11, they like break us out of those moments, and we find them. It's interesting hearing your story about your church, because I mean, you've probably bumped into some of Tim Keller's work in the recent years, especially down in that Presbyterian country you're in, and like, his church didn't. It ended up being several thousand people up in Manhattan, but before 9/11, it was relatively small, and that it was that catalytic experience of people passing through that and yielding to like the spiritual during that time that actually increased its scope and influence. Obviously, he was a gifted person, and that's what that would make me think of. The other piece is I've had a conversation on here with a guy named Tim Krell. I met him at Symbolic World. He says he's a Protestant monk. They live up in New Jersey, and they're on a small compound. And the interesting thing about this, they're not really connected to Orthodoxy, Catholicism. They're kind of an independent deal. But he works in code and computer and software. But they live in a commune, like of families, like lots of families. But they're not averse to technology. They're not averse to culture, and learning things. He was at Symbolic World, and we had a lot of conversations about trust and about, like they share, like their community shares a purse, like that's how deep. And I know you follow Elizabeth Oldfield's been kind of playing. Have you followed her much on the internet?
I know who she is, but I don't follow her.
She kind of, her and her husband and kid cohabitate with another couple on in this idea of shared space and shared life and shared trust, like deep trust. And these ideas, they keep coming up, and I'm looking at that one, I'm looking at this one, I'm looking at Jordan, I'm looking at my own, and thinking, how do we, and maybe this is what your work with the Trust Foundation, which is something I want to touch on, is how do we continue to cultivate and make this less, how can you make something that's actually not supposed to be a concept conceivable for people to grasp that vision? What are the ways? I mean, do you think it's automata? Do you think, like, I know Paul Vanderklay's, the estuary stuff that he's working on, like,
okay. Yeah, you're putting it right. It is, for the most part, almost nobody is constructed in such a way that they are prepared to receive these kinds of concepts as concepts. So what you're left with is they have to have experiences. Now the experiences are on a continuum. There would be something like automata, which is a cultivated, structured protocol that brings you into a particular experience that would then allow you to ground the concept and then grasp the concept to some degree. Then there's like Helene, right? It's less structured, more intense. And what is the phrase? The beatings will continue until morale improves. Right? The crises will escalate until communion improves. Like, that's just the reality of it, is that because we are at the tail end of this civilization, or we are in the process of it falling apart, of its breaking apart. Crisis both is precipitated by that state and accelerates that state. And so it really isn't a choice of whether, it is a choice of how. I would recommend estuary over Helene. Maybe. I mean, for a lot of people, definitely. And I would recommend Helene over, the Bronze Age collapse. But it is experience. So there's no other way around it. You have to actually have the experience. The experience has to have enough intensity and enough vulnerability, enough intimacy to be able to enter into reality. And well, okay, so Pajot, we each gave a talk. Like, I gave a talk on day one, he gave a talk on day two. In his talk, he coined the phrase, I think. So sometimes Talmud is called the art of hosting. But he spun a little bit. He said the art of hosting angels. And then he brought us to the image of Abraham and Sarah and the three strangers.
Yep.
And then the image of Lot, Sodom, and the same three strangers, as far as I can remember. Noticing that the first is an example of the art of hosting angels, and the second is the example of the anti-art, right? Or how not to do it. And notice that when you do it wrong, it's in fact destruction. And the point being, in some sense, that it's almost like God didn't destroy Sodom but rather it's because they were already in the process of destruction. God pointed at that's happening. And the opposite, the Abraham was able to cultivate a protocol. He activated the protocol of hospitality. And in the protocol of hospitality, we now can enter into this relationship with the vertical. Right, with the higher, with the eternal, with the divine. And in the context of that, and I'll say, by the way, just hospitality and reality are the same notion. Right? That we enter hospitality as a protocol that allows us to cultivate reality in the context of the stranger. What we'd like is a protocol to cultivate reality in the context of community, and that's called Eucharist, I suppose. Now that I think about it. And wow, that just first time I've thought that, and that sounds exactly right. But in both liturgical practices, one orienting towards the stranger, the other orienting towards the community or the self, and both, though, have this potent verticality that reorients us to that location where wholeness is, the isness of wholeness, and also has the ability to incarnate or condescend down to us so that we can participate in it and come into that with each other. Horizontally. So the horizontal coming into a horizontal wholeness by virtue of relationship with the vertical wholeness.
One of the things I'm curious with your church community, and I know everything's kind of been wild, and so it may be on the back burner as far as like what are we doing, or maybe there are conversations happening specifically related to Helene, but maybe back in a more general sense. I spent a lot of time contemplating or being involved with, ideas around church growth for about a decade and a half. And, the word evangelical, like that operates as the telos, which is the message, the good news. And so what's the goal? It's to get as many people the good news as possible. And that has turned into kind of an entrepreneurial scale project. Startup culture. And I've seen that. I experienced it. I think it's, and one of the things I know that you talk about is like the scale, maybe I can't say this right. Maybe it's the scale of relationship, and so I'm in a situation where, I'm with about 25, 30 people. I have all the tools. I know all the tools. I know how to play. I know all this stuff, like all the church, we did it, in our town of 10,000, we had 500 people, come, in my old, like, I know how that, and I can just feel and sense it's like Isengard, like the gears of church growth wanting to be fired up. So that
Isengard's a really good metaphor.
Yeah. And I feel that, like, that's what it just comes to me in waves at times. And But what I know is true is that this community is being formed and established on deep trust because, like I mentioned earlier, not necessarily directly from me. I had had my own journey with trust, but there was a breach of trust in another situation that that caused this group to coalesce. And then, but it's easy to kind of say, okay, now let's get this thing. And I'm just so opposed to that idea.
Mhm.
And I think, the when we talk about things like what's downstream from what's downstream, I know that in the evangelical culture that everything that is promoted is downstream from church growth, like this movement still. Now, I think that some of that's changing, like with younger people, and as a result of it, being a part of the institutional collapse that you're talking about.
Mhm.
I just don't know if they can see it. It's very hard. That's why I guess part of that this was underneath part of the question of like, how do we get people to, and so I'm in a situation, we have a guy who I used to work with, who is coming back to like be our actual pastor. And he's coming back to, a very small group of people. This is a professional person who's, uh, you know, but I believe he's coming back because he trusts the people that he's coming back to. It's
Mhm.
not because this is the
Mhm.
right business move, the right professional move, but because he trusts the people, and that we're going to take care of him and that he's going to take care of us
Mm.
in a serious way. But I think that that's almost too glorious that you don't want to look at it. And so we want to look at like, okay, let's go back to status quo. Um, I don't know. I'm just kind of getting this out there. But I guess the question I have for you is, I wonder if you have in your church conversations seen or felt some of those tensions, or are able to recognize them, or kind of like integrate with what I've talked about related to like church growth culture, startup church culture, and whatnot.
Okay, so first, I feel pretty comfortable saying, dear evangelicals, or dear anybody who puts church growth culture near the top, that's actually wrong. And here, let me explain why. There's a couple of concepts that are useful. You mentioned three words. One is trust, one is relationship, and one is care. And here's another. I'm gonna make it a couple of different maps so we can put them properly in the right place. Then we have scale, and I'm going to just use growth as the alternative. Right? So scale and growth are not the same. You can grow at the speed of trust. You can grow at the speed of care. You can grow at the scale of relationship. Those kinds of things. Scale is different. Right? And scale has to do with the ability to increase a metric, increase a number rapidly, right? Which by the way, it requires decoupling and decontextualizing from specifically trust, care, relationship. Now, the nature of the good news, at the very minimum, is the triune God and the invitation to come into relationship with the Trinity in the way that the Trinity is in relationship with it themselves. At a minimum, right? And there's more to it than that. Well, if the invitation into that is intrinsically decoupled from the underlying reality of how a relationship works, then it is at best a performative contradiction. And in fact, in many cases, more likely, more fundamentally heretical, meaning it will lure you away from the thing that it is presenting you with by its very nature. And so quite destructive. So what does it mean? Go ahead.
We see that in mass. I look out across and I don't think there's just like evil people. It just seems like it's endemic to the culture right now, from my perspective, from my experience and what I've seen. But go ahead.
Well, it's a very, very common error. It's a continuous error, and we make it in the culture all over the place, and we've made it in the culture for a long time. And in others, this is like trivial. I'll trivialize. You can cause a child to have calculating facility with arithmetic by means of rote learning. reliably. So you can scale a certain a quality of competence in arithmetic. You can scale it. You can reliably cause lots of children. Like think about it like stamping out with a machine, stamp, stamp, stamp. But this has nothing to do with cultivating the ability to be in a relationship with math. In fact, it's the opposite. Essentially every child who has that encounter will reject math as soon as they're not forced to. Yeah. And they have learned nothing about math. They've just learned how to be a mediocre calculator, right? So this is a very common part of our experience. It's an industrial model, right? The industrial model as a formal context, as an unconscious presupposition of how life works, which is then projected forward into how we do everything, which again, this has things upside down. Your relationship with God should be more fundamental than your unconscious presuppositions about the nature of civilization. Right? Your cultural presuppositions should not be able to guide or condition your relationship with God. Your relationship with God should be more fundamental and therefore shape, guide, and navigate and sort and filter and shape the culture. And that's like that inversion is very, very difficult to maintain, right? Because we tend to, golly, just think about all the different theological elements that come up here. We tend to rest on our own understanding. We tend to want to render things in ways that make sense to us. Like there's so much that continuously comes up in this environment. And of course, this is why the Beatitudes come across the way they do. Right? Christ is giving an inversion story. The way you think you understand the world, it's actually upside down. Deal with that. Once you've dealt with that, you've reoriented in the right direction. Now the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Right? Come on in. The water's fine. You'll be baptized and reborn. Let's see. And this conversation has been actually very present at my church during the context of the hurricane, because we noticed that there was a presencing of something like, there's something strong here. Like we're doing the thing that we have talked about. We're doing the thing that we think that we ought to be able to do, and we're actually doing it. It's a little bit like saying, hey, up until now we've been practicing, now we're in the game. And it's actually operating the way that we had hoped that it would or expected that it would in some sense. Neat. This is real. And a continuous surprise, maybe surprise is the right word, astonishment that we aren't planning. There is no planning. There is no strategy. There's no business plan. There is no entrepreneurial mindset. And we have a hesitancy. Like on the one hand, clearly, yes, we want to bring all people into the kingdom. And something about bringing in 500 people, moving us from 150 to 500 feels like it might actually break something. Yeah. And definitely there's no intent. So it's more along the lines of, hey, if God wants to bring 500 people into this church, God has every capability of bringing 500 people into this church. When you look around, you're like, how many people here were brought by anything other than astonishment? Everybody's just like, I don't even know. I still don't know why I'm here or how I got here. It's, I look around the room just this last Sunday, like half the people have been plucked in some profound way, have found themselves migrating into this and can't quite explain why, but there's definitely, they're guided by faith. They're guided by a profound sense of what their life has cultivated them as the direction towards the God the Father. And I think it's just how it's supposed to work. I mean, now, then again, right? Then you got your ortho bros, and I love them. I love the ortho bros. Or now I don't have just ortho bros. I've now met some ortho ladies, and they're amazing. They're beautiful. Purity, so strong, and there's a lot to be said for purity. The allurement, the attraction of and the degree to which purity is intrinsically convicting. Like just so much is. I cannot and must not. I must become vastly better just by virtue of being in the presence of a like Pagio's wife. I don't know how he endures the intensity of how like awesome she is. I'm sure he's had to have grown into that over time. So that's awesome, and there's definitely something going on there, no question. So the challenges are what do we do? Like, how do we deal with this? And this is another question that has come up. How did that work? So 3 weeks right after New York, maybe a week after New York, when I was in New York City, I had already prearranged a gathering of people which was all spirit driven. Like I didn't know exactly what, why or who, but every time I would encounter somebody, I was like, that person's supposed to be there. I'm not sure why. Fair enough. Keep a list, send it out. Hey, you guys, I don't know why, but I think for some reason we're supposed to get together. None of you know each other. Come. So we did. We had a gathering. And as it turns out, a big part of what happened in the gathering is a conversation about what is the emerging form of the church. Like there's something going on, right? The form of the church is going through a profound transformation by necessity. We're in a moment where that's just going to happen. And what's happening, or better, how do we relate with that properly? Like how do we live in harmony with what's happening? And so I guess the short answer, or the extremely long and convoluted answer to your question is, yes, this is very present at my church now. It's extremely alive by necessity because it continues to grow in ways that are surprising and encouraging. And it grows, right? It does not scale. We are not averse to having more people, but we are definitely averse to trying to have more people.
Yeah. I like that. Not averse to having more people, but averse to trying to have more people. That's simple, and I think could be helpful. I want to completely shift gears here. I want to get your take on the election, the political, because I mean, I follow you on Twitter. I mean, it's hard not to. It's hard not to be swept up in just the cultural moment of change, it seems like, and radical in the sense, and to see these things. I guess what's your general take on what's happening right now with the, what do you call it, red wave, or what's your how do you?
I call it the red religion.
Okay, so
remember that, dude? Do you have familiarity with that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Blue Church.
Awesome.
I mean,
yeah, okay.
So I mean, that makes the sense. Red religion, Blue Church. Is that what you? Yeah. Is that the okay?
That's what I called it way back in 2016.
So, but I mean, I saw you posted on, or you retweeted, I guess it was the Naval Ravikant talking to Scott Adams, and it's like, these people from Silicon, your kind of heritage in the States, Silicon Valley, and this, Elon Musk is like the archetype of that world, and it's like, I can imagine it's just not, it's hard not to be excited in a certain way that this is there is a possibility for that to enter in, shake things, was it Zuckerberg, move fast and break things, like opportunity, that Silicon Valley culture to just, completely collide with the government in a certain way. It seems like that's kind of happening. And I just want to get your general thoughts and takes on the cultural moment related to this election and all that.
Well, as you might imagine, there's going to be a lot. So
buckle in.
Well, don't. What I want to do is say maybe open. Like there's a lot. So no particular thing. Don't let that close, but just say okay.
Okay.
So for example, I think it's notable that Naval is not Elon, and Elon is not Vivek, and Vivek is not Mark Andreessen, and there's no particular point upon which these people all agree. They have different lives. They come from different contexts. They have different relationships to lots of different kinds of things. And the way that they have begun to orient towards pointing in a similar direction is meaningful. Right? It's actually a very meaningful thing. It tells you that there's something about that direction that has consilience. Right? There's a reality to it. All right, so that's one. Two, it is actually quite potent, and from my point of view, quite what was the word you said? Not enthusiasm, but in that same vernacular. When the great men of an era are aligned to go work on something, right? And it's all, in some sense, all social. Like the likelihood that real shit is not going to get done is low.
Yep.
Because the people who have been gifted by God with the potency to do real shit are now all picking up shovels at the same time. It might not get done. It's very difficult. I mean, very difficult to know. But if there's ever been a moment in, I don't know, since World War II, where things were going to change in a big way. Now is it? And that's one vector. One vector is you are actually for the first time seeing the actual people who are the best at getting shit done. And this doesn't matter, by the way, whether you like the shit they do or whether you like them personally, but they get shit done potently, right? They can lift heavy rocks. And they're all gathered.
Heavy rockets.
Yeah, they can lift heavy rockets. And they're all pointing more or less in the same basic direction. That may not last for a long time, but this has like a World War II sort of sensibility. It's like, hey, you all don't like each other, but we're all going to get together and fight those guys. They're like, okay, boom. And you got your, what was it called? Oppenheimer. Remember when he starts, he's just yelling at that scientist, like, why would we do that? It's like, because the fucking fate of the world hangs in the balance. Okay. That's kind of what's up.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. Next. I am reasonably confident. I'm certainly acting as if, so I have an existential commitment to what I'm about to say. I'm reasonably confident that we have, in fact, actually moved through a cultural transition moment. And we've moved through a portal, to use Eric Weinstein's sensibility. I don't think it's just a honeymoon. That what had to emerge, from 2016, right? The Red Religion, the arc of that, right? What had to happen for that to come into enough self-consciousness and agency to be able to overcome these significant forces arrayed against it, to break through, is a real thing. Right? That's a birth-giving process. That's how it happened and how it happens in general. Okay, so something new. We're in something new. And we're in something new, if we'd like to say, that is akin to, say, the Depression, World War II moment, or akin to the Civil War moment, or akin to the Revolutionary War moment, like this kind of thing that comes sort of every 4 or 5 generations and has lots of change built into it. Okay, so that's 2. Objectively, we have been poised at the edge of crisis for a while. So there's a lot of different crises that are occurring simultaneously. We have the crisis of accelerating change, right? We have the crisis of AI. We have the crisis of the geopolitical realignment, right? We have the crisis of our human relationship with the environment. We have the crisis of the insane death cult that has taken complete control of our entire culture, all the way down to the finest granularity. And I don't mean like coarse grain stuff, like Canadian suicide buckets. I mean school and watching TV and being on cell phones, like everything, food, right? Everything is insidious, distributed Moloch worship. Just take that. We actually do live inside an insidious, distributed Moloch worshiping cult. And we've been there, right? That's where we've been. And perhaps we have the escape velocity to get out of it, or at least get away from it for a moment. Perhaps.
Something I want to interject is, you can say that in one way, and Alex Jones says that in a completely different way.
I could try, but I can't really pull an Alex Jones. The guy's got verve. He's got a, obviously,
what I'm trying to say, well, yes, I know, but he's been saying that for a long time.
Mm-hmm. This is the thing, as far as I can tell. And I remember this about the frogs being gay, because I happened to be having a conversation with the guy who's the world's expert on the concentration of estrogens in fresh waters and the effects on amphibians, before I saw Alex Jones. When I saw Alex Jones saying they're making the frogs gay, I'm like, yeah, that's actually, it's a weird, but it's exactly correct in a weirdly poetic way. So a lot of the stuff he says, I take as, well, I don't know why it is that you articulate it in this fashion, but if I can understand it properly, you're pointing to something which is profound and true.
Yeah. Well, cults and these things are no longer really separate, or like you said, they're going all the way down in our phones, and popular culture is just, completely inundated. There's no separation. And but the 26, we go back to that date. I felt it in my life. I had a significant change in my life at the same time. Like, that's when things just came to a complete head with truth in my own life and culturally. And so I've been riding this wave too, in a certain way since. And it just felt to me like this that the amount of gaslight just came to a point. That's how it's felt. That's just how it's felt. You know, you could listen to some people talk about it on Rebel Wisdom, or you could see these things happen. And some, 20-year-old is at the Capitol during the riots in 2020. And I'm like watching this in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, just like my mind is being blown, the George Floyd riots and all this stuff. And yet it's like, well, Trump's policy on this versus Kamala Harris's policy on, I'm just like, that's not what is. How is that just, no, we need to look at yes, to a degree, but it just seems like it's so much that is in itself a gaslight if you believe that that's actually like really important, because it's like you can't even look at like how someone voted in the Senate over the last their career and say, oh no, they're not talking about that now, there's something else. I'm like, no, I don't think so. Like,
well, so maybe like this is a thing that I've been thinking about over the past few days, in terms of a narrative emerged and is endeavoring to cough its way out of the last vestiges of the legacy, legacy media, that some individuals appointed to the cabinet are quote unquote not competent or not, what's the right word? Credentialed, some word like that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about credentialed culture.
And as I thought, and I actually, even on Twitter, people who I would think, from my point of view, would maybe be able to think more clearly about it, have also either said stuff that I'm like, that doesn't seem right, or are confused. And the way my mind like settled on it was, well, let's say, for example, like the guy who's the Secretary of Defense, I think Esgath is his name. I don't know him. I don't know much about him, but let's say, oh, if you think he's being appointed to run this machine, then yeah, okay, you're right, that he's not a good choice for that. But if he's appointed to dismantle it and to fight against it with commitment and with a certain level of self-sacrifice, then he may be exactly the right guy. All right. And so it's like, what world are you living in? What nature, what is the question that you think is actually being asked? And which is a frame control, because gaslighting is also a lot about frame control. Right? So if we're trying to maintain a frame of, no, keep feeding the machine, then the proposition that this person is not competent implies that keep feeding the machine is the frame. You don't say keep feeding the machine, you say he's not competent, which implies, oh, well, how could that make sense? And maybe even tribally, if I want to be part of this tribal, I have to adopt that frame unconsciously. So that kind of stuff is going on. But I want to go a little bit deeper because, much more evidently, I think this is true very much profoundly in 2016, but much more evidently in 2024, this wasn't really about Trump. In fact, after the assassination, he was largely withdrawn. Like he was there, but he was nowhere near in the front of what was happening. Right? You had the big RFK moment, right, where suddenly MAGA and MAHA co-emerged with each other. And RFK is not signing up for big chunks of MAGA. Like he's not saying, hey, I'm here to bend the knee and serve, Trump and align with him on every policy. What he's saying is there's something going on that's bigger than both of us. And he's actually explicitly saying it's spiritual. In fact, Trump is explicitly saying it's spiritual. You may not believe it, but I think it's hard not to believe Kennedy's expression. I tend to believe both, but in any event. And then you get all these other folks, right? Musk participates. And you might say cynically, well, Musk is looking for a way to leverage control in politics, and probably true. And the guys expressly said, hey, by the way, I'm also playing Diablo at the highest level in the world while doing all the rest of this stuff with just my left hand. Like I'm only playing with my left hand. My right hand is tweeting, right? And who knows what I'm using to buy Twitter with. But by expressing that, he's letting you know, yeah, of course, this is part of a strategy. And also, maybe this is bigger than me, right? There's something going on that is bigger. So that notion of what's unfolding, what's the unfolding, and what is actually carrying these things along, that has the power of drawing in people from that wouldn't naturally seem to fit together, right? They aren't part of a alliance, like Thiel calls it the rebel alliance, which I think he took from Weinstein, actually. I think Eric may have taken that from me, but it doesn't matter. But the Empire, right, and the Rebel Alliance, it's a good archetype for at least Gen X. It may be millennials too. Do you guys watch Star Wars?
Yeah, I'll be 40 next year. I was alone in my Star Wars watching, but yes, I watched it religiously as a kid. Still do with my son.
We had the advantage as Gen X's that they were only the first three. So all the heretical elements were not part of the story. It was just the core canon for an entire generation.
I was 14 when episode 1 came out. So I'd lived in from like 4 to 14 with the first 3. So I'm kind of
yeah. You were sort of held. So I think a lot of what's going to happen over the next year, right? Because it should likely unfold rather rapidly, is going to be governed by the degree to which something is unfolding that is happening at a much higher level. Right? A spiritual war has been happening for a long time, and some big pieces of that are now beginning to show up. And we can see it, we can witness it almost diagnostically. Now, of course, the individuals involved have a real role to play, but it's like the shape of the space that they're operating in is governed by something very different than they themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they tried to embody some of this during, the campaigns after 9/11 with re-invoking the axis of evil. But I think that was what really, when you harken back to the World War II times and when we were really going up against these powerful world dominating forces, that would be more akin maybe to how it feels. And I guess something I was wanting to ask you about is, we say these things have a place on the stack and where they should be in priority within our heart and our mind and these things. But it's hard for me not to just be like, pop the popcorn, man, this is exciting. Like like what's going to happen? That's how I feel. I guess a lot of people are scared, but it is, or insecure or something, but like I am kind of excited in a way, and it's hard for me not to feel that way, I guess. But I don't feel like it's not gloating. It's just like the bubble feels like it has popped, and it is. I'm interested to see if it does, if the Doge thing really does Doge. Will it actually do what it says? And like
moon, you could say it that way. You can keep
is
crossing.
it gonna go to the moon? Yeah. Is it gonna take off? And
so, well, I feel like just a moment back, I want to just I'd like to use this opportunity to rebuke in the most profound way possible everything connected with the neocons. I would like, and if, by the way, if Doge would like to add a guillotine division, I'd be more than happy to run the guillotine with regard to all of the neocons, right? The moment of 9/11, which was a profound movement into reality for the world, certainly for Americans, but I noticed at the moment, right, so whatever 9/11 and 9/12, there was a movement into reality and an opportunity to step into that reality, which was utterly prostituted by the neocons.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the most divine sense possible. Right. And so therefore, I hold them deeply responsible for some of the most profane and ugliest things that are imaginable. I would like to hold them personally responsible if that can be done. Now, I have been told, and I believe this is correct, that it is vengeance is God's, not mine. So at that point, I will step back and let God can work out what he wants to work out, and he certainly will. But just to take that moment out there, and it simplifies things tremendously, because if you go out in social media and you just tag individuals as neocon or neocon adjacent, you can use their signals to tell you which direction evil's coming from.
Wow, that's a bold statement, and it has been more clarifying for me, politically in this. I think all those things used to be very ambiguous and abstract to me, but through the last 8 years, those things have become, and I think that in some ways, maybe this is harsh, but you're deluding yourself to think that it's not, that it is business as usual and status quo of years gone by. Like I just don't see that, but I wasn't there at those times either, but I don't know. I wanted to, it is animating. I feel animated by it, and I don't know if I should, but I do. And I think sometimes,
you might as well, right? You might as well step into life. It may have been an accident or a mistake, but stepping in is better than stepping away, even if you step in shit. Give me a sec. I just realized I have another meeting I got to make sure I don't miss.
Okay. Yeah, we can.
Yeah, and it's in 8 minutes, so I guess we got to wrap up quick.
Yes, sir. Sounds so. we didn't really, I guess the last thing is just if you would be interested in talking about the Internet of Humans and what was it? The trust. What is the
Trust Foundation?
Trust Foundation.
No.
Okay.
Keep watching for what do you call it? Hints and
Easter eggs.
Easter eggs, yeah.
Okay, I take that. And
it's for those who need to know.
Need to know and ears to hear, eyes to see. Sounds good. Let's see. I've got a list of things. I'm gonna wind us down here.
No, I gotta go.
All right, man.
I'm out of time.
But thanks for your time today, and meet me back in the space.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thanks for reaching out.
All right, see you, Jordan.
Bye.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.